Hello and welcome to the eBiology Teacher Podcast on the nervous system. I am Mr. Doc and I am ready to tell you all that I can about the nervous system, including the major structures, the nerve impulses and how they work. We're going to talk about different types of nervous system or categories within the nervous system. And we're going to talk about how we perceive senses. Now, I said I'm going to tell you everything that I can. There is something that's important to note, and that is of the organ systems, the nervous system is probably the most difficult one to study because we don't necessarily 100% understand it. Okay, that's not to say that we don't know what the pieces are. We not to say we don't understand necessarily how they work. We just don't have as much information about the nuances of the nervous system as we do about other systems within the human body. So while we do have some basic understanding, and I'm going to share that with you today, keep in mind that some of this stuff is going to be sort of difficult to understand because we don't necessarily understand it all. For example, what is a memory? Okay, well, if the brain is a series of chemical and electrical reactions, that means that there has to be a unique chemical or electrical reaction for every memory that everybody's ever had. Well, that's a massive amount of information. So there are some things that we don't necessarily understand completely or that are beyond the scope of this lecture, which is just an introductory lecture. So hopefully we can get past that and kind of get to the basics and understand that. So let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, the purpose of the nervous system is to communicate and control mental and physical activities of the human body. It's also responsible, in large part, for maintaining homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant internal environment, which means that there are some things that happen in our body naturally, automatically, that prepare us to continue to live. For example, our heartbeat is part of homeostatic condition. It is what we, it's what kind of, oh, that's nice. It's something that we don't have to think about, but because our heart beats, we can maintain that constant internal environment because materials are being delivered to all the cells in our body. The parts of the nervous system include the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. But the nervous system really can be divided into two subsystems. The first being the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system's job is to relay messages and to process and analyze information. The central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So the central nervous system really is housed inside the skull and the spine. The peripheral nervous system, which can be divided into two divisions itself, include the sensory division, which is designed to transmit information from the sensory organs to the central nervous system, and the motor division, which transmits impulses, from the central nervous system to muscles and glands and whatnot. So we've got the peripheral nervous system, which really is composed of spinal nerves and sensory nerves throughout the body. And then we have the central nervous system, which is really the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are really responsible for processing and using all that information, basically the central control. And then the peripheral nervous system basically carries out the demands of the central nervous system while collecting information for the central nervous system to act on. So the peripheral nervous system really takes in all the information, sends it to the brain, which is part of the central nervous system, and processes it. Then the brain sends that information out to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is what does the actions that the brain dictated it to do. All right. So let's take a look at the brain. There are four large portions of the largest portion of the brain, the cerebrum. We refer to them as lobes. Now, the frontal lobe is the thought center of the brain. And if you recall seeing some old movies about people getting lobotomies, what they do is literally drill into the forehead and kind of scramble egg some of those brains, which messed up the thought processes. So if people had homicidal tendencies, they'd give them a lobotomy and they'd come out and go, oh, hello, I'm happy, right? So that's kind of what that was. But it's a thought center. It's right here in the front portion of the brain. The parietal lobe, which is in the back part of the brain, back top, or I should say dorsal and superior, would be the parietal lobe. It's the integration portion. It's the portion of the brain that kind of takes all this stuff in and combines it together. The temporal lobe is the smell and sound part of the brain, where the occipital lobe is the sight center of the brain. But then there's this little portion down here at the bottom, which is called the cerebellum, and that's the motor coordination portion of the brain. Now the brainstem, which goes up into the brain and connects to the spinal cord, so this portion here, it contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and really is the portion of the brain that controls most of the automatic stuff that goes on. So our heartbeat, our breathing rate, and all that stuff, that is really controlled by portions in the center part of the brain and the brainstem. That's sort of centrally located, which, if you think about it, makes evolutionary sense, because if that's a really important part of the brain that maintains all those automatic things that just have to happen, they have to happen at a regular pace, you'd want it on the inside where it's nice and safe. Okay, that also explains, by the way, why neck injuries can prevent us from breathing or having a heartbeat on our own. If someone breaks their neck in the right spot, then that can interrupt those natural functions, because that's where they're regulated, is on a portion of the brainstem. All right. Now the spinal cord, which emerges just from the base of the brain, extends all the way down the vertebrae. And the vertebrae is not a bone, or it is a series of bones called vertebrae, each of which has a protective bone on the outside and an opening on the inside through which the spinal cord can kind of travel down. It also has openings that allow these little peripheral nerves to go out and into other parts of the body. So each vertebrae has a portion of the nerve, the spinal cord, going through it. But each vertebrae also has peripheral nerves that go to different parts of the body. This has particular impact because if we think about it, if you've ever seen a doctor or one of the medical shows where they're touching people's hands and feet and legs and saying, can you feel this, can you feel that? What they're really doing is trying to find out if there's a spinal injury, where did it happen? Because if I can feel the top of my foot, but not the bottom of my foot, and let's say my foot's not involved in the injury, I may have hurt my back or my neck, by knowing where sensation stops, we can find where the injury was. You see, because these spinal nerves that come off each go to a different part of the peripheral nervous system. So if we have a damage, let's say at this nerve here, then the parts of the body that are controlled by these peripheral nerves won't work properly. As a matter of fact, if the spinal cord itself is damaged at a point, generally speaking, depending on the severity of the damage, everything from that point below will not work properly. Okay, which brings us to the idea of quadriplegia versus paraplegia. If someone is injured at a certain point in the back, more specifically the neck, then it is possible for them to lose function of pretty much everything from the waist down. That's paraplegia. But if we have an injury to our spinal cord in the neck, we could lose function from the neck down. Well, then we start going, well, that means that the heart and the lungs wouldn't work, right? No, remember, we just said it a couple minutes ago. Those homeostatic functions like heartbeat and breathing rate are controlled way up in the top toward the brain stem. Okay, so the breaking something in the neck here may not prevent those functions from working, but the ability to move one's arms or the ability to move one's legs could be impacted if in fact the spinal cord was severed at any one of those points. Okay? Now, neurons, which sometimes we call nerves, but nerves are really bundles of neurons, send electrical signals called impulses. Now, neurons transmit these impulses from one part of the nervous system to the other, and neurons really have an arc or a path. For example, a sensory neuron goes from a sense organ to the spinal cord and then to the brain. So basically it carries information from the sense organ to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord conducts it to the brain. There are some sense organs, by the way, that innervate directly into the brain itself, so they can skip the spinal cord column. So, for example, your eyes. Your eyes go right, your vision is not affected by your spinal cord because it innervates directly into the brain itself. Now, motor neurons send a transmission or an impulse from the brain to the spinal cord, out that peripheral nerve to the muscle that we want to move, hence motor or motion. So the brain to the spinal cord to the muscle explains a motor neuron. Now there are some neurons that we refer to as interneurons that connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. So it creates an arc where we perceive information and then our muscles move based on the information that we perceive. A nerve impulse occurs when basically the ionic balance or the charges of a nerve become unbalanced. When a nerve is at rest, the inside of the nerve has a net negative charge, and the outside of the nerve has a net positive charge. And that's kind of confusing, but ultimately what we really care about is we have sodium-potassium pumps, which we talked about way long time ago. Those keep an ionic imbalance, okay, and status quo, homeostatically speaking, the nerve wants that imbalance. And I realize, by the way, that that's against the idea of osmosis, diffusion, because we want high to low, right? We want things to move to equilibrium. Well, sodium-potassium pumps prevent equilibrium. But if this ionic balance shifts, okay, if the ionic balance shifts, we perceive an impulse. That impulse will travel all the way down the length of the nerve. Now, to take a look at that, I do want to go back one slide and kind of highlight something. This right here is the cell body. This is the axon, and then these are the axon terminals. So if something causes an impulse, basically what will happen is that imbalance will travel all the way down the axon to the axon terminals. Once it gets to the axon terminals, that's when either we're going to pass that impulse on to the next nerve, or that nerve is going to cause something to happen as a result of the impulse itself. Now, a nerve response is caused when environmental conditions trigger something. Another neuron will send an impulse, and that trigger will trigger an impulse to the next neuron. The impulse is carried from the cell body, like I said earlier, here, down the axon to the point of termination, to the axon terminal. Now, because this is a predictable chemical reaction, it makes us think all impulses then have to kind of be the same. So an impulse is either an on-off or a yes-no. It's a binary situation. You either have an impulse or you don't. So the question then is, why do we feel some things but not others? Well, that's called threshold. We have to provide enough stimulus to activate the neuron in the first place. So there are some times where we could put pressure on our hand and feel nothing, but as the pressure increases, the second that we reach threshold, that's when the neuron will start the impulse that we will actually feel. This should also bring into your mind another question. Well, if impulses are either yes or no, why do we feel some impulses with a greater degree of severity? For example, how can we feel the pain from someone stepping on our toe versus the pain of someone stabbing us in the leg? Well, it has to do with the number of impulses that are coming and the number of nerves that are sending those impulses. Because if we have something that is perceived as pain by one neuron, that's going to be perceived as pain. But if we have a whole bunch of neurons sending impulses that say pain, we're going to go, whoa, that's a lot of pain, okay? So it's not that the impulse is stronger, it's that there's more of them, and in fact, they're probably more frequent, which is why we can vary the degree of sensation. We can kind of rank pain, or we can rank heat or color or a variety of different stimuli because of the number and frequency of the impulses that our brain receives. Now, when the impulse hits the axon terminal, it reaches what's called a synapse, which is basically a space between nerves or nerves in a cell. Chemical substances called neurotransmitters will carry that impulse across the synapse to the next cell. Then we have basically these receptors that take those neurotransmitters and go, oh, wait a minute, I'm receiving an impulse, I better do my thing. If the impulse reaches the terminal, then it exceeds what's called the action potential, resulting in the response happening. So these neurotransmitters go and activate sensors on the outside of muscle cells that tell the muscle to contract or relax or whatever it is that it's trying to do. The problem is that these neurotransmitters can be affected by several different drugs and alcohol. And we will get to that toward the end of the lecture, because obviously we know that alcohol and drugs can affect our nervous system or how we react or how we think. We should have, by the end of this lecture, enough information to understand how and why it does that. Okay? Now, we do have sensory organs. Sensory organs are basically informational. There are 5 senses which we know, each of which allow us to perceive information from the outside world. Information is transmitted from these sensory organs to the brain, where that information is then interpreted. Now, this is an important point. Interpretation of what we are perceiving is what the brain does. Sensory organs simply send information, basic information. The brain then compiles that information to make an understanding. Okay, so it's how we perceive that information that makes the difference. And I'll use an example here in a minute. Hopefully it'll clear it up. Now, your vision, for example, your eye contains sensitive nerve cells called cones and rods that perceive different wavelengths of light. Different wavelengths of light we recognize as colors. So our vision is based on our brain's perception of the input of light. Now, our eye is ingeniously designed because if there's too much light getting in, there's so much information we really can't process it. So what we have to do is we have to focus that light. So when the light comes on, our eyeballs go, right? Now, they start to respond in a way. In the dark, our eyes have to find the light and focus on it. So we start to, our eyes start to dilate and open and close and open and close to control the amount of light getting in so that we can perceive it properly. It also explains why if you're in a dark room and you walk outside, you're in the dark room, your eyes are so open and they're just trying to find light. When you walk out into the bright room, it's like, oh goodness gracious, too much light. Got to close the eyes down so that we can control the amount of light getting into the eye so that we can process the information that's coming in. Hearing is obviously conducted by the cochlea in the ear, which perceives vibrations. As air around us vibrates, it vibrates the cochlear the hairs in the cochlea, and what we do is we perceive those as sound. It also has to do with our balance in that there's fluid in our ear, and as that fluid is level, we perceive that as our balance. If that becomes imbalanced, we perceive dizziness. Taste and smell, I think, are fascinating because taste buds on the tongue really are chemical receptors that test for things that are dissolved in saliva or things that are dissolved in food that touch our tongue. Nose perceives chemical compounds that are in the air that is in our nose and in the back of our throat. So when we taste something, what we're really doing is our brain is taking information from our tongue and information from our nose and combining that into what we consider flavor. By the way, I just perceived a really loud bell. What happens is our brain takes the information from the chemical receptors in our nose that has tested molecules in the air, and then information from our tongue that has tested molecules that were dissolved on the tongue and in those taste buds. And we combine those into what we consider the flavor of whatever it is that we happen to be eating. Now, this explains, by the way, why when I have a cold and my nose is stopped up airflow isn't going in there, so those chemical receptors are blocked, and I can't perceive the molecules that are in the air in my nose. So when I taste something and I have a cold and I can't breathe, or when I pinch my nose, it's because the taste sensation is incomplete. It doesn't have everything put together like it's supposed to. Okay? So it's true. There's some times where you can't taste stuff when you have a cold. That tells us that when we eat that, a lot of flavors coming from those molecules that we perceive by the scent receptors in our nose. But if we were to eat something like salt, for example, while we have a cold, we can taste that perfectly fine because salt doesn't get into the scent or air receptors in our nose. It dissolves on the tongue, and we can taste that just fine because it really doesn't have an aroma part to it. So taste and smell are intimately related. All right? Now, touch are sensory receptors in the skin that perceive pressure and temperature. So basically, if we feel pressure, what's happening is our nerves, our sensory receptors in our skin are saying that I feel pressure against the skin. Our sensory receptors for temperature, once again, will basically test for kinetic energy of particles. The faster they're moving, the hotter we perceive it to be. Pretty easy stuff. Now, this takes us to a good point, and that is if we understand how things in the nervous system work and how nerve impulses transmit and whatnot, why then are some of the things automatically done and why are some of the things voluntarily done? That takes us to this page. The somatic nervous system, which the word somatic, which we already know from our study in mitosis, means body. Okay, so the body's nervous system is primarily the peripheral nervous system, and it's responsible for actions that are conscious, things that we have complete control over, like wiggling our toes, jumping in the air, writing notes, pressing keyboard buttons and mice. Whereas the autonomic nervous system regulates functions that are automatic or involuntary. Now, before we describe that a little bit more, the word auto generally means self. So the autonomic nervous system really means the self nervous system, the one that takes care of itself. All right. Now, examples of this include our heart rate, our breathing, and our reflexes. These are things that we don't have to control. The autonomic nervous system takes care of them. Now, the autonomic nervous system will also make a judgment or adjustments if the environmental conditions change. Okay, so if we perceive ourselves as being in danger, the autonomic nervous system kicks into gear and makes some changes in our body so that we're prepared to fight or flight or whatever it is that we have to do. If we are injured or if we're sick, our autonomic nervous system kicks into gear and says, okay, something's going on here. We're going to have to fix this. All right. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are the effects of drugs on the nervous system. I told you we were going to do it, so here we go. Stimulants like caffeine and speed, amphetamines, for example, increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your breathing. They do this because they increase the amount of neurotransmitters that are being released from nerves, specifically in the brain. Now, a lot of people report that when they're on stimulants, they find themselves to be more aware. They feel like they have a heightened sense of awareness. They feel like they can do more. This is a false perception because what's happening is we have more neurotransmitters being sent out, but they're not under control. They're involuntary. So when people report that, what they're really reporting is a perception that they're more aware, when really what's happening is their nervous system is working overtime, and it shouldn't be, because they don't have control over all those things that are going on. They don't have complete control of their actions necessarily, or of their body, because those neurotransmitters are being released because of the drug, not because the brain wants it to be. Now, depressants work in quite the opposite way. They decrease the heart rate and breathing, and they slow relaxation, or they cause relaxation because the nerve responses are slower. Alcohol and marijuana are both examples of depressants, and basically what happens is they slow down the release of neurotransmitters by slowing down the nerve impulses. Now, when I say slow down, we may be talking about a very slight slowing, okay? But when we talk about the nervous system and we talk about its job having to be instantaneous, even a little bit of slowing can be a bad thing, all right? So let's take the motor sensory arc, for example. If we see something that we want to avoid running into, our eyes go, okay, brain, you're going to need to move or you're going to get run over. And then the brain goes, okay, spinal cord, send that down to the legs. The legs take that and the legs start to move and we move out of the way. If that arc is slowed down, it means you're not going to move as fast. And if all parts of those arcs are slowed down, that time starts to add up. So our brain slows in our perception of what we're seeing. Our brain is slow in releasing the nerve response. And then our muscles are slow in converting that nerve response into action or locomotion. All right? So alcohol and marijuana are both depressants. Now, stimulants and depressants are a drug it's commonly taken together. For example, bell number 2. For example, if you were to take Red Bull, which is a highly caffeinated drink, with alcohol, like vodka or something like that, you're exposing your body to two chemical substances that are trying to get your body to do two completely opposite things. You're trying to stimulate with the caffeine while depress with the alcohol. This isn't good because it can hide signals from your body that your body needs to feel. For example, if you drink too much caffeine, your heart rate can become too fast. But if you take a depressant, the signal from your heart going, okay, I'm beating a little too fast, I'm having to work too hard, doesn't necessarily make it to the brain in time. And in fact, people who have abused alcohol and stimulants at the same time, like Red Bull and vodka, have actually died from heart attacks that they didn't know they were having at the time. All right. Now, cocaine is another drug, and it is related to the opiate category. What it does is it increases the dopamine in the brain, and it creates a high sense of pleasure, or what's generally referred to as a high. Now, the dopamine basically gives our body a sense that this is normal and we're way up here. Okay. The problem with that is it's just a perception. And when the dopamine wears off, we fall back to normal. The problem with that is the brain doesn't see it as being falling back to normal. The brain sees it as a depression. So normal now is a constant state of depression, meaning that normal is no longer comfortable. The only way to really experience is to be high. So things like cocaine and other opiates are highly addictive, not because the person necessarily feels good when they're on them. It's that the person feels really, really bad when they're not, because what happens is that artificially elevates the brain to a point of perception of pleasure. And when you drop down to normal, which is perfectly fine, the body perceives that as being very, very negative. And again, they're very, very addictive. Dopamine and other endorphins also can compensate for pain. So certain opiates are used to basically block pain. The opiates get in the brain, and the brain is such in a euphoric state that when the body is sending sensory information that's saying, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, I'm in pain, it can't get through because the brain is flooded with all these chemical compounds that say you're in pleasure. Well, once that wears off, the pain floods in. People can't deal with that. So once again, the opiates are highly addictive because if you're feeling chronic pain that's always there, some people believe the best way to deal with that is to just block the pain. And that can be a very dangerous situation. So I think it's important to understand that yes, drugs can have an effect on us, but now that we understand the nervous system, we understand how they affect us. And ultimately speaking, at least the way I think about it is, we don't completely understand the chemistry of the brain. We're making great strides every day, but there's still an it factor that we just don't have. So I'm not exactly sure it's a good idea to start throwing chemicals into the brain that alter chemical processes that we don't actually understand in the first place. It's kind of like letting a fox into the hen house. I don't know what's going on in there, but I'm pretty sure it's not anything good. Okay. Now, let's talk about our objectives. To describe the major structures of the nervous system is pretty simple. You've got the brain, which comes in lobes, and each part of the brain controls something different. You've got the spinal cord, which connects the brain to the rest of the body. And then you have peripheral nerves that lead from the spinal cord to the rest of the body that control everything from sensory to movement. A nerve impulse occurs when an action potential causes a change in the balance of the ions that exist in a nerve. It travels down the nerve, and at the axon terminal, neurotransmitters are transmitted either to another nerve, which sends the impulse down another nerve, or it reaches the point of a muscle, which ultimately results in movement. Now, the peripheral and central nervous system are both related, but are quite different. The central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, is responsible for the coordination of all the activity. In other words, it receives, processes, and acts on information. The peripheral nervous system basically collects information and acts on what the central nervous system tells it to do. Finally, the structures involved in the five senses. We've got eyes, which perceive wavelength, or receive information about wavelengths of light, and then it's perceived by the brain. We have chemical receptors in our mouth and nose that perceive taste. We also have sensory receptors in our hands, which perceive pressure and temperature. And of course, we have those all over our body, not just our hands. And finally, we have nerve cells in our ears, which perceive vibrations, which we, in our brain, convert into sound. All right? So once again, the nervous system is an amazing thing. It takes in lots of information. And there's one little last bit of note, and that is there are some times where we receive information, we act on it, and we realize that the information was wrong. Keep in mind that our brain is processing tons of information constantly, okay? So if the flow of information into the brain is disrupted in some way, or in some cases is incomplete, our brain will act on the information that it's got. So if you cover your eye and you move it, and you cover your eye and you move it, things look different. Well, your eyes are kind of seeing the same thing, but remember that your brain is receiving information from both eyes and it's combining it at one time. So it's like a factory worker. I take one from this chute and one from this chute and I put it together and I send it down the line, right? Well, if one of the chutes stops giving you information, you just have that one thing. That's not complete, but that's what you get anyway. So if we have an impaired ability to perceive or to take in information, our brains are going to basically make up the rest. They're going to have to go on the information that they've got. All right. So that's the end of the lecture on the nervous system. I certainly hope it helps you clear up any questions you might have. And I hope it makes you ready for all of the things that you will perceive in your lifetime. I'll see you online later.